Okay, let's get started. This is going to be the history of NeurOptimal, moving from the earliest days, from the five-phase model, all the way up to where we are now with full AutoNav. And I'm going to do that using a keynote presentation, which is the Mac format of PowerPoint. And we'll be along questions and additional comments, but this is a good way to organize the material. So if you have questions, the best thing to do is to use the chat area, and you can send the chat just to me directly, or you can post it more generally for everybody to see. And just kind of depending on how it goes along, there may be times when it seems like I'm not replying to a question. I'm just trying to weave it in as we're going along. Okay, so what makes NeurOptimal unique, effective, and efficient across the range? It involves the vision, the technology, and our clinical experience, and we're going to look at each of these three in more detail, obviously. Vision is where we're going, and that's a comprehensive adaptive training system for everyone to use. We are on the cusp of releasing Personal with AutoNav. When that happens, then we'll have a truly automated, comprehensive, and adaptive system that can be used by essentially anyone, anytime, with no training at all. This original idea was grounded in Freud's posthumously published paper, A Project for Scientific Psychology, in which he basically described the central nervous system as an energy transformation system. And in that day, when he wrote it, 1895, if I'm not mistaken, 96 maybe, the dominant metaphor at the time was steam engines. And that's actually the reason that we have inherited this idea of drives. It was really a good translation of the German for desire. But because the dominant metaphor was steam engines, drives were seen as literally being like the drivers of a steam locomotive, so pushing the system along. Actually, originally it was desires. So a better translation, in my opinion, of the title Instinct and its Vicissitudes would be Desire and its Transformations, which does put a little bit different slant on the whole thing that Freud was up to. But that's a matter for another presentation another time, I guess. The bottom line of the Project for Scientific Psychology is that if you understand the dominant technology of this age as being information technology and therefore computers, and you start to understand the energetic transformations that Freud was talking about in terms of literally energy, not just steam, but also information, because those are intertangled in some very interesting ways, then you can understand this idea that there could develop a technology like what we've developed that could feed back moment-to-moment, real-time, in a self-correcting, completely autonomous fashion, the information the central nervous system needs to correct itself. And essentially, in the Project for Scientific Psychology, in one of the last chapters, one of the last paragraphs, excuse me, Freud says, well, someday we'll have technology to do this, but until then, we have to rely on dream interpretation, hypnosis, etc. So we're grounded in that original vision, as well as in the neuropsychology as developed by Karl Pribram, especially the ideas of efficiency and effectiveness and his understanding of the centrality of perception as a holographic event and how entangled that is with memory, and that those are best understood in terms of Gabor transforms. And that means that, of course, we're going to be computerized and individualized, not just sort of generic or diagnosis-based. We're really looking in the project as a whole for NeurOptimal, we're really looking at having this comprehensive adaptive training system for everyone to use with no prior knowledge, with no particular skill. And one of the reasons that it would work is it was inherently fail-safe and fault-tolerant, but also it was individualized moment to moment, so diagnosis would be irrelevant. The technology is how we do it. Of course, in the very beginning, I was about 30 years away. I had this vision early on in a broad way, actually when I first was reading a lot of Freud, and that was actually back in my last year of high school, which was my junior year. And then I went to Georgetown undergraduate, and Karl Pribram presented. And this was right during the time that he and Dennis Gabor had gotten together and discovered that Gabor's transforms were the mathematics that worked most elegantly to capture the interference phenomenon known as perception and memory. And Pribram was presenting on that, and I kind of got the two ideas together because in his presentation, he did a whole thing about how the central nervous system perceives and how that can be best understood in terms of Gabor transforms and all of this. And he said, and someday we'll have technology that will be able to do this real time. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And then I started extrapolating out just how much computing power you'd need and how long it would take for that to become widely available. And it was very clear that from the perspective of 1973, I guess it was at least 30 years out that we'd have really technology that could support that kind of vision, even at a beginning level. And part of that was because it needed to be small, portable, and powerful. We didn't want to be tied to mainframes, which is what was the dominant paradigm at the time. And the idea of it being portable meant that the technology could be moved to where the need was, not having to bring the people to the technology. So until about 30 years after that initial sort of vision, it was really just a thought experiment based on the mathematics of quantum mechanics and real information processing, namely Dennis Gabor's work. And then, of course, there's the third leg, the clinical experience, which is actually doing it. Needed to not only bring the vision into reality as soon as possible, because after all, that was the idea, but the technology was limiting that, but really so as to carefully refine and extend the technology and vision based on actual work with clients. So it never was just a hunch, but was always based in the hard work of transforming suffering one person at a time. A lot of the work that I've done individually as the team contributor, if I can say it that way, for the work that Sue and I have done together. A lot of the work I've done has been involved in the actual programming of the code, but a whole other layer of it, which has been relatively unseen in many ways, is all of the data analysis that I've done over the years to understand what really was happening in neurofeedback training processes, regardless of what people thought they were trying to achieve. And that has involved extensive looks at data from a wide range of systems over the years. And I still continue that work now. When I see interesting data or hear about interesting data, I always want to look at it and see what's going on actually, because a lot of what is presented is not actually reflected in the data from other perspectives. And that's something that impressed me early on, not only in the field of neurofeedback, but in other fields as well, because I do have such an orientation to really looking at the data. So the clinical experience of doing it over the years, transforming suffering one person at a time, was a critical component of refining how the technology was increasingly able to implement this sort of broad and comprehensive vision of what was possible. And that iterative process of those three legs really was foundational in allowing the vision to come to fruition as it has. So the vision, the passion, all of it got put on the shelf 30 plus years ago, and would have stayed that way except that I went to work at a hospital, started back into biofeedback, then met Sue, and ultimately we got married. But before there was Sue, there was the 5-phase model of neurofeedback training. There's the article is still available. It's available through our website. It's also available through the online version of the Journal of Neurotherapy. For various reasons, it actually was put into the second issue of the journal. But it was an interesting model because at the time, neurofeedback was really divided into sort of two camps. There was the SMR beta camp, and the thinking there was that we needed to decrease what was called, quote, theta, but increase SMR or beta, or both, alternatively, in order to either help quiet down the central nervous system or to help activate it. SMR being the quieting or calming target, beta being the energizing or focusing target. The other strand in the field, besides the SMR beta folks, were the alpha theta folks. And the alpha theta folks were much more interested in states of consciousness and kind of a follow-on, if you will, almost to the psychedelic 60s, and the interest in meditation and alternate states of consciousness and spiritual practice, etc. And there was a great deal of disconnect between these two groups because the SMR beta folks saw themselves as the real scientists and thought that the alpha theta folks were kind of fringy, flaky, and would taint the field. The alpha theta folks were seeing that the SMR beta folks were just too pathology focused and were kind of missing some possible bigger pictures for the technology. But it lent itself, this division lent itself to some very interesting conundrums because there was a large lack of precision in how the language was talked about. And so both camps, if you will, used the term theta. From one perspective, the one camp, theta was a really bad thing and needed to be gotten rid of or minimized, and the other, theta was like the brass ring and really what you wanted to go for. So one of the things that was clear to me was that there was some fundamental lack of precision in the language and in the technology and looks at the data, but also there was some fundamental paradigm problems. And I was always interested in trying to integrate the field instead of make it fall into little disparate parts that had no connection. So the 5-phase model was a way of trying to organize that division, if you will, of SMR beta versus alpha theta into one organized approach, because the general rule of thumb was you would do beta up, theta down to work with, say, ADD, but you absolutely wouldn't do that with an alcohol addiction situation because that would make it worse. Instead, there you would be increasing alpha, particularly with eyes closed, so that the client could relax enough and have the alpha theta crossover moment, etc. Well, my point was, well, what do you do if you have an ADDer with an alcohol addiction? Because you do one thing, you're going to make the other condition worse, presumably because of this great divide. So I organized the model into this 5-phase approach, which could be used with everybody. It didn't matter what brought them in. They could be started in phase 1. And each of the phases had very precise criteria for success and therefore moving ahead. And all of that's outlined in the article that I did, the 5-phase model of neurofeedback training article. So phase 1 was SMR augmentation with inhibits. And early on, the inhibits that I started looking at were broader than the general ones used in the field. But Back then, equipment was very limited. We would have one channel of EEG in general and have 3 potential filters, one that could be an augment and 2 that would be an inhibit. And one of those inhibits almost always had to be for muscle movement because of the way the technology was at the time. So the first phase was SMR augmentation with inhibits. The second phase, when phase 1 was successfully completed, would be beta augmentation with inhibits. The third was alpha augmentation, still with the inhibits. And then once that was successful, then alpha augmentation without the inhibits. And then the last phase involved a very special piece of equipment that had 4 channels and allowed for synchrony training. So it was an actual global synchrony training device. And it's one of the main reasons that I got back into the field because I was working at that hospital. They wanted to bring biofeedback back into their operations. So I asked to be sent to a conference to see what the state of the art was, went to a conference where somebody said, oh, well, we have equipment that can train brainwave synchrony. And I said, great, hook me up. I know how to do that state from my meditational background, so let's see if your equipment really can capture it. And in fact, it actually could. So I looked at the technology, realized what they were doing, and thought, okay, we're still about 10 years out probably from what I want to really be doing, but now's the time to get back into the field and start pushing the envelope. So that was the global synchrony, this 5-part. Each of the phases had a slogan. The first was just let go. This was the SMR augmentation. And SMR really is a letting go, sensory, motor, rhythm. It's when you're sensorially engaged but motorically quiescent. So it's also known as the cat frequency because it's the dominant frequency when cats are just sitting motionless, are fully engaged in sensing what's around them so that when the mouse moves, they can just pounce right on it. So just let go was the phrase, the slogan for the first phase. The second was just focus, the idea being that beta augmentation, beta is really about focus, but it's focus by exclusion of everything but the focal target. So in the extreme, it really becomes the fight or flight response and the tunnel vision of just focusing on the perceived or experienced threat. So just focus. Then the phrase or slogan for the third phase was just relax. This was alpha augmentation with eyes closed, of course. So it is just relax. And the fourth phase was when we allowed for alpha theta crossovers to occur. So the slogan there was just allow. This was the moment of the insight, the eureka experience. And there's a very nice literature describing those kinds of experiences as promoted by a variety of training approaches, all loosely organized under this alpha theta concept. And then the fifth phase was just be. So there really isn't any task, if you will. It's just be, and even just notice that you are just being and allowing the global synchrony to progress by itself. So the 5-phase training was largely single channel. The first 4 phases were explicitly single channel with an active at CZ, reference ear clip or cup sensor on mastoid or FP1, ground via the ear clip or cup sensor on C7. That's cervical 7, so back of the neck, was the best site to use for that ground back in the old days with the limitations of the technology. Just wanted to check and make sure that I've got the ability to, there we go, that's what I want. Okay, great. So you'd use other single sites in order to potentially speed up the process, but also to derail the progress is really what happened. Back in the day, the whole mythology around hyperlocalization got started. And part of it got started in the observation that if you tried to uptrain SMR on the, quote, wrong side of the brain, you could actually hyper accentuate the effects and create difficulties. And similarly, if you trained up beta on the, quote, wrong side of the brain for beta uptraining, you could create side effects. Partly those side effects came from the low-level technology and the use of non-phase preserving filtering operations, because those had nonlinear effects that were not useful at all. But also it was because the lateralization effects could be used in some ways if you were skillful, but it took a lot of skill. So for instance, in phase 1, you might lateralize the CZ sensor, which is right in the center of the coronal band between the ears, right at the top of the skull. You could lateralize to C4, which is what we use now as an active site, for phase 1, because the SMR training was largely oriented at that time around the right hemisphere. And that might increase the training response, so how quickly the client responded or how clearly they responded to the feedback. But doing so also increased greatly the risk of negative responses, partly because you did accentuate the training, and so you could easily overshoot the target and really not only help the person calm down a bit, but move way beyond that and move into actually getting somebody to be overly tired and not as alert and oriented as they would like to go back into their daily living. So part of the 5-phase model was the premise that even if you went to lateralize in order to, say, increase the training response of SMR, lateralizing to the right at C4, or increase the training response to beta in phase 2 and lateralize to C3 to train beta up on the left, that in each of the phases, when you had achieved what you thought was the increased training outcome, you'd then go back and make sure to test that at CZ. So CZ was always the internal reference point, if you will, the gold standard. And that was true regardless of the phase. So you could move down the Z line if you wanted to facilitate alpha, because most of the alpha training at that time was done occipitally, so much further towards the occipital poles than at the central or coronal line. But similarly as to lateralizing for phase 1 and phase 2, if you moved down the Z line back to the occipital region or towards the occipital region for phase 3, then you would bring the sensor back to CZ before saying, okay, now it's time to move on to phase 4. So you never move on to the next phase until the work of the prior phase was consolidated, and the consolidation was always tested at CZ. And if global synchrony training was not available because you just didn't have that piece of equipment, then just continue doing more of phase 4, and the global synchrony will arise on its own. It was also very interesting to consistently be presenting over the years, particularly in these early times, about just how naturalistic the training really could be, despite all of these beliefs that were out there about how tactically precise one had to be and all of that. It's fundamentally clear that if you continue with, say, phase 4 work and alpha augmentation and taking off the inhibits of the old equipment, if the client was really resilient by that time, global synchrony came up by itself. You did not have to specifically feedback global synchrony in order to have it arise and stabilize. It would occur on its own. It's the way the central nervous system works when it's allowed to go into those states and not externally constrained from them or otherwise pushed or prodded. So technology was the big limitation. Only so much was possible back then. The work was effective and safe from the 5-phase model, but it could take a long time. As the technology gained in sophistication and availability, it also came down in price, And so I started thinking about what I really wanted to do way back from the vision I had kind of had in this broad stroke back in early days in college and in high school, and then how to implement that actually empirically. Like, what would it really take? By this time, Sue and I were together. The 5-phase model came beforehand, but we got together while I was teaching that. In fact, that was how we met. She came to one of the first training events I did where I was explicitly talking about the 5-phase model. So at this point, as the technology started to improve, Sue started exploring clinical alternatives, other ways that the training could be done potentially. And she was especially wanting to find alternate possibilities to speed up the overall process while also maintaining client safety and comfort. So targeting is the essence of all neurofeedback training. All systems track changes and events in the joint time frequency domain and feed back to the client information about what is happening. Hold on just one second. There we go. Then there are 4 questions really around the process of targeting. How do you decide what to target? Now that sounds pretty obvious, but do you decide based on a belief or perspective on the way the brain is organized, and especially in terms of localization theories, and that therefore because alpha increases when the eyes close, that we'd want to train, say, in the occipital region for alpha augmentation because that's where the largest part of that shows up in QEEG and it's the visual center, etc. So how do you decide what to target? And then the question becomes, well, what do you actually target? Because it's very interesting over the course of time to see the beliefs that people have had about what their neurofeedback let alone biofeedback systems, are actually targeting. When you look at the underlying data, the beliefs don't match the data, don't match what's actually happening. Number 3 is, how do you know that what you actually target is really what is responsible for facilitating the change in the client? I've always been intrigued at the lack of good outcome measurements. It's not to say that people can't demonstrate, well, we did some kind of a procedure and the client's life got better. That's one level of outcome tracking, and that's obviously important and fundamentally important to the client. But from the point of view of refining the technology, trying to actually see what really changed when the change occurred for the client, it's frequently just been missed because people have already made their choices about how to decide what to target and what they're actually going to target, independent of what the data changes during the training. So it was fascinating to me, one of the things we're going to talk about in a bit, to discover that when beta is uptrained on the left side in sort of that classic early model, that SMR itself renormalizes on the right side and can't not. The two go together naturalistically. It's the brain trying to renormalize itself as opposed to being simply pushed in some abstract desired orientation. The 4th question, which at one level is so obvious that I was always intrigued at how little consideration was given to it really in the field. How is it that so many different targeting approaches all yield some direct training benefit? I mean, it's fundamentally been clear over the years that although certain approaches, what I would call limited approaches, have better statistics in terms of outcomes for certain focal problems or situations, whatever, and worse with others, that by and large the overall field has a fairly consistent outcome measurement for when it works. And that number is something that you would pretty easily predict in terms of Pareto's law and that sort of thing. But it's just been fascinating to me that there's been so much arguing over all these specific implementations when the overall outcome data shows that everything kind of works. So clearly it couldn't be the hyper-specialization that was the critical factor. Well, while I was sort of going through all of this, looking at data and also thinking in terms of the mathematics of all of this and the programming and the physics and all of that and these sort of fundamental questions, Sue started changing training sites and frequency bands. And she was following along on ideas from various others, including the Othmers, and using other equipment, including Biograph and neurocybernetics. Back in the old days, the original equipment that I started with was CapScan, the CapScan Global Synchrony equipment in particular being something that was the only platform that could do that. So I used it for everything, even when I was just using a single channel of training, but then also got the single channel equipment from them as well. One of the things that was interesting when Biograph was introduced was that it actually had 2 channels of EEG that could be worked with. But Sue was changing locations, changing filters, changing feedback events. We tried a lot of different things, and she kept asking me to sort of push the technology and try to use different tones for feedback. This was back in the days of electronic M&Ms, where you'd get beeps and boops, or moving bar graphs, or pseudo game kind of responses from the computer interface when the feedback events were fulfilled. It was kind of an interesting exploring time. And one of the things that allowed me to do was really dive into the Biograph system as well as other technologies. And it was fascinating for me to dive into Biograph because it allowed for 2 concurrent channels of EEG with multiple concurrent filters and a wide range of feedback events. You could use almost any kind of audio-visual. Of course, movies back in the day were very slow because the computer implementations were just not that efficient. But it was possible. It was possible with Biograph. And it also had some automatic thresholding, which was really quite revolutionary at the time. Back then, thresholds were all static and usually specified by number. So you literally had to put in a number, a value. Say you wanted 10 microvolts of alpha to be the trigger for for the feedback event. And if the person was over that, but the inhibits were fulfilled, then they'd get a beep. The next evolution became variable pitch, so that the higher above the threshold they were, the higher the pitch went, or the lower, and all that kind of thing. Well, Biograph really had the widest range of possible feedback events, as well as the ability to automatically threshold by moving average. So the software would look at the behavior of a particular channel of data over a threshold of up to 256 samples, which was about a minute, about a second's worth of data, excuse me, and it would then sum that up, come up with an average, and float the threshold around that moving average, which was kind of an interesting bit of technology. So I was exploring those technologies to see what was possible, and also using those technologies as well as some other tools that I had in software to do after-the-fact analysis of successful neurofeedback training. And I collected and reviewed actual training data from a variety of systems for many years because I was actually also doing tech support for all of these different systems. I became widely known for teaching how to use virtually any piece of equipment and how to cross-implement different protocols and that sort of thing. That allowed me access to a lot of training data from a lot of different practitioners, as well as the systematic processes of that data collection I implemented over the years. And some really clear features began to emerge specifically from analyzing the actual data of the training that was done using a variety of equipment and approaches. So I started formulating this orientation of looking for what makes neurofeedback training sessions successful, and then also presenting that. So a lot of the presentations that I was doing at the time through SNR and AAPB and at Future Health involved those data explorations. And so Sue and I kind of were doing things in parallel, where she was sort of clinically in the trenches trying all these different things with clients. I was seeing clients back then, but also really just dove into the data and the technology, trying to really tease out what was most effective. So one of the things that was very clear was that what made a successful session was decreased emergent variability in, across, and between states. So the stability, the resilience was marked by decreased turbulence, as we would talk about it now. So decreased emergent variability. It wasn't just variability, because that's averaged variance, and that's really not helpful. No averaged statistic is helpful in the context of a nonlinear dynamical system. It's just not. So it's decreased emergent variability. It's also what makes neurofeedback training successful, or how you can tell it's successful, is that there's a reemergence of the roughly 7 hertz resonances that ripple throughout the spectrum from the basement all the way up to 60 hertz, which was a pretty hard cutoff back in those days. We really couldn't look above 60 with the kind of equipment that was available to practitioners. And it was really these two factors that would predict the successful outcomes, regardless of the kind of neurofeedback training that was actually done. So it didn't really matter what the person did. There was decreased emergent variability in, across, and between states, regardless of how the feedback was done, or it wasn't successful, regardless of how the feedback was done. And it was there was a clear reemergence of this roughly 7 hertz resonance pattern rippling throughout the spectrum that would reemerge. And what was interesting to me in presenting this data and these conclusions was how adamantly resistant the field was, even though the data was fundamentally clear. And partly that was because most of the other technologies didn't have any good way to visualize decreased emergent variability or even the ongoing spectral response, particularly of 2 channels. So it was quite revolutionary when what Sue and I came up with was this idea of having a bilateral spectral density display showing at the same time that we were showing the targeting operations, and that actually what we were primarily looking at was the bilateral spectral density to see the effect of the training. And once you began to have that orientation, it became very easy to notice if the client was starting to get a little bit agitated, for instance, or a little bit more reactive, and then change the training, change maybe the threshold levels, or the intensity range of the thresholds, or make some modification in order to decrease that agitation, and to be able to do that even before the client knew what was happening. So if we go back to the 5-phase model, which was what was still operative at the time all of this was going on, that was the actual intervention model. The 5-phase model integrated SMR beta, alpha theta, and global synchrony training, which was all of neurofeedback back then. It was a way to integrate the entire process. Single site training at CZ demonstrates that it's centrally mediated control mechanisms that really work. I remember an early presentation where I was talking about CZ training and presenting the data, and Barry Sturman at the end from the back of the room said, well, you know, why do you want to train at CZ? He was adamantly opposed to CZ training because he had these beliefs about the way the brain worked. And you know, he said, why do you want to train at CZ? I mean, don't you know where that maps out on the homunculus? Well, the homunculus is the mapping of the human body along the sensory motor strip, which passes right through CZ. And the actual CZ site maps out to the anus. And so he said, don't you know where it maps out? I mean, CZ maps out to the anus. I mean, why would you want to train there? And of course, the room, broke out into laughter. This was my first public presentation on the 5-phase model, all of that. And having done presentations for quite a while at that point, I let the laughter start to die down. And I said, well, but Barry, you and I know that for some people, the fastest route to their brain is through the anus. And of course, the room totally erupted at that point. And it was an interesting beginning to a long-standing relationship with Barry, where actually having that kind of interchange allowed us then to talk, even though we disagreed. It allowed us to talk in a way that he just couldn't dismiss the ideas. So it was very clear that you could train, and not only could you train at CZ, but you could reliably, safely, and effectively train at CZ regardless of what walked in the door if you followed the guidelines of the 5-phase model. It was, revolutionary at the time, and so much so that it was very difficult for people to actually even hear this idea. So the remaining question was how to make it even simpler and more efficient. And what has been really interesting to me is that for years, the 5-phase model essentially became the working model, despite it being dressed up in other terminology. It really did become the way people worked. I mean, people started working SMR first, then beta, then alpha augmentation with the inhibits, then alpha theta, and then would do other stuff. And it remained that way for a long time, even after the period 3 approach came in, and but still sort of unknown that the basis of it really was the 5-phase model. So it was kind of fascinating to watch the field as a whole dancing with these ideas and sort of reluctantly adopting them unawarefully of what the source was. So a little bit more review of the 5-phase model. It was a simple, comprehensive model of CNS functional transformation that was effective across the range of disorders. The implementation was not equipment specific. In other words, one way or another, it could be done with virtually any piece of equipment. And that was one of the reasons I became technical support and teaching presence across all of these pieces of equipment, because I really could show how you could use whatever box you had on hand to do this fundamental approach that just worked if you followed the guidelines. And it was based upon sophisticated linear analyses of specific frequencies and their correlates in consciousness, which of course ultimately became the cartography of consciousness that we put out. And it was an interesting earlier presentation at an SNR where I presented the first outlines of the cartography of consciousness. And the next presenter came up and said, that's exactly what I was just about to present. And that was Mike Tansey. So it was very interesting how the field was evolving at the time. So what were the criteria for transitions between the 5 phases? Well, clinical change was the real thing, especially sleep consolidation and reestablishment of circadian rhythmicity. I was always intrigued that nobody wanted to talk about how central sleep renormalization was to successful neurofeedback. And I think it's partly because sleep, was always sort of the ugly stepchild, if you will, of clinical work for so long. It wasn't seen as really that important. And I think that partly was the case because there was such a commitment, not only in neurofeedback, but elsewhere to, discrete etiology, discrete treatment. And the recognition that sleep renormalization was fundamental kind of across clinical presentations in mental health really undercut that. If you could get clinical change just by consolidating sleep and you didn't have to chase the tail of all the disorders, it was intriguing to me that was seen as somehow not okay. You needed to find out what the real problem was, which of course was separate and distinct. And the data just didn't support that. So clinical change, especially sleep consolidation and reestablishment of circadian rhythm, client reportive symptom resolution. I've always been oriented to the client telling me how things are going rather than me telling the client. I always saw it as my task to make the client as safe, feel as safe and gently handled, if you will, the training process to be gentle and comfortable. And so as an implementation of, first of all, do no harm, and allow the process to work, taking my guidance from the client. I had real issues with the ideas that you had to force people to feel awful things in order to heal them. It just didn't make sense to me. And the data work didn't support that belief either. So clinical report of symptom resolution, and in terms of EEG, the 3 and 5 hertz remain under 10 microvolts with the equipment at the time, without significant surges with new augment targets. So every time you transition between a phase, you'd be looking specifically at the activity of 3 and 5 hertz in terms of its emergent variability. That's the significant surge part. But that the average response at those frequencies would be under 10 microvolts in the equipment at the time. That really meant that the client was resilient regardless of the task or the correlate of consciousness that you were working on. It doesn't do any good to have somebody relax with their eyes closed, start to produce alpha, and then have 3 and 5 hertz start surging, because they start experiencing a sense of dis-ease without having their vigilance attuned to the external world. It doesn't make sense to try to push that person through there. It makes much more sense to go back and re-ground the work of SMR uptraining and beta uptraining so the resilience is really there, then move into the alpha, keeping the inhibits in place until they can alpha augment with fulfilling the 3 and 5 hertz criteria. Then by itself, the 7 hertz crossover occurs and the eureka experiences happen. We don't have to push that. Another criteria was doubling of the initial augment target amplitudes. Back then, everything was looked at in terms of amplitude. So you could also look at the training outcome just in terms of amplitude with that equipment. And if there was a doubling of the initial augment target amplitude, so a doubling of whatever they started with for SMR, and the 3 and 5 hertz activity was remaining under these criteria, then it was clearly time to move on to phase 2 and move with the beta. And that same kind of orientation held throughout all the phases. What are the clinical findings? Well, CZ referential placement was effective. Other sites and placements can accelerate or derail clinical change. The frequency targets were different from the traditional bandwidths, and change in amplitude is not necessarily predictive of clinical change. It wasn't just change in amplitude. We really had to have this doubling along with the stability in 3 and 5. So that's kind of what I was doing. I mean, what was Sue doing while all that was going on? Because we really were sort of working in parallel, almost like a parallel play kind of thing. And it was a lot of fun to do that. Her explorations in the direct clinical work, mine in clinical work, but also really just diving down into all the data and the technology side and really crunching the numbers to see what was going on. So one of the things Sue was doing was discovering the role of 23 to 38 hertz, which we ended up calling dredging and mulling, and that was a very important inhibit target back in the day with those technologies. And we still have that time frequency envelope as one of our core targets in the regular paradigm. She was also suggesting back then sort of the unthinkable, which was, well, we have these 2 channels of EEG. What about if we get both of them working at the same time? So what would happen if we concurrently did the same training on both sides? So SMR up on both sides, for instance. Or what about even more challenging, what about if we did SMR up on the right side while we did beta up on the left side? I mean, what a concept, right? Because instead of having to sequence those trainings, you could perhaps do both at the same time. That would make phase 1 and phase 2 be a new joint training, and that's going to take less time, presumably, than sequencing through. Of course, it was fascinating to watch the field say, oh, you can't have the brain do more than one thing at once. It'll get too confused. I thought, oh, that's really an amazing premise. Really had to say much more about the paradigms getting confused, which is what they needed. Certainly brains can handle many things all at once. Uh, that's how it's designed. You know, it's not just a single thing, right? So Sue was exploring multiple alternative targets and multiple alternative feedback events while keeping the overall training safe, because both of us had this commitment to make it as gentle and safe as possible, especially when doing alpha theta work. Back then, the net premise of alpha theta work was that the ab reaction was what was transformative. And this actually goes back to Gene Peniston himself, who was the originator of the alpha theta work. He was convinced early on that it was the ab reaction that was the therapeutic aspect of alpha theta work. It was fascinating. The last SNR that he went to, I had a quick conversation with him where I said, you know, what I found is that the ab reaction actually slows the process down. And if you just keep the 3 and 5 hertz inhibited, that was the technology at the time, it's a very gentle process and happens much more quickly. And he said, you know, I've been thinking that too. As we get more sophisticated, that's pretty clearly the way it is. So it was fascinating to have him change his perspective, again, based on increasingly sophisticated equipment that allowed us as a field to look at these differentiations between 3, 5, and 7 hertz. Because in the old days, the theta band was 4 to 7. Missed out the most important stuff at 3 hertz, but lumped in the 7 hertz with it. And that really led to the confusion as to, you know, what's the difference between good theta and bad theta. Well, let's do this another way, and I'll describe the parallel path that led to developing training based on 7 hertz resonances and the period 3 approach. Because what I've described here is sort of what was going on as the 5-phase model was evolving in concert with increased technology sophistication, as well as with the directed clinical experiences that Sue had in discovering, you know, various ways to speed up the training and pitfalls in doing that too, you know, what you needed to stay away from. So what we did was basically compress the 5 phases into the period 3 approach. Phase 1 and 2 combined into period 1. Phase 3 and 4 combined into period 2. And period 3 replaced global synchrony. So we collapsed 2 of the phases into 2 periods. And then the third period, period 3, we had a way of training that got rid of the need or even the benefit of the global synchrony training per se. Now, it was very interesting to call this period 3 because particularly in the wake of the 5-phase model, which was very clearly a linear model. You began at phase 1 and then phase 2, then phase 3, and if you needed to, you backed up to phase 2 to reconsolidate, then went on to 3, then 4, etc. Period 3 was never that way. Period 3 was never start with period 1, then period 2, then period 3, although a lot of practitioners did it that way and still do essentially. It's for a long time, once it got out there, versions of it then became kind of the way people trained. But I used to joke that I should never have talked about period 1, period 2, period 3 because it sounds like they sequence. I should have called it, you know, period 1, period blue, and period elephant because it's really one blue elephant. It's not one, then blue, then elephant. So period 3 approach was also named, though, because period 3 behavior is taken as a primary criteria for nonlinear dynamical systems. There was a very famous classic paper in the field, period 3 implies chaos. And so it was a great way to capture this transition from linear models that were really predicated upon the linear and constrained technology at the time, the software and hardware, and to start to really come to the fore talking about the nonlinear dynamical processes, because it's fundamentally clear that the central nervous system is a nonlinear dynamical system. It's fascinating to me how it's taken so long for that idea to gain ascendancy, along with the ideas of using joint time frequency analysis. I remember the first several times I would talk about time frequency events or time frequency envelopes, people would say, well, what is this time frequency stuff? We've never heard of it. It's like, yeah, well, I guess maybe not. So it was interesting to try to bridge these disparate worlds. So anyway, the period 3 approach was clearly non-linear control of CNS functional transformation. Simple, powerful, comprehensive, simple but not simplistic, and mathematically elegant, but built upon the 5-phase model, consolidating what had to have been separate phases in the past because of the technology, now into 3 periods that could interchange because the technology was much more flexible. And in particular, that was the biograph system. And it's nonlinear because period 3 implies chaos. So what were the distinctive features? Well, we had static, dynamic, and dynamical thresholding. Static, fixed thresholds were able to be used, dynamic, the moving average stuff, but also dynamical thresholding. When we started dancing around the current value coming out of the thresholds, coming out of the channels of data and the filters, and very interesting behavior came about because of that. We actually did this originally live at a Future Health, where Sue and I were trying to demonstrate that not only can you do SMR and beta training at the same time and the person's brain doesn't blow up or melt down, but also that you can do it without telling the client what you're doing, and the client's central nervous system will sort it out. So I had her hooked up live, and I had the outputs projected in a way that she couldn't see. And we had exactly the same feedback events for SMR or beta, the same tone. So the only feedback she was getting was these tonal events, and they were the same, whether it was SMR augmentation or beta augmentation. And while the audience watched, and Sue couldn't tell, because I was sitting behind her so she couldn't see me either, I would alternatively and then randomly bring the SMR and then the beta band into play, and she would respond in terms of her central nervous system responding, and then even be able to say, oh, yes, well, that's the SMR, isn't it? Oh, yeah, now you're doing beta. Oh, now you have both of them going, don't you? So it was clear that we could do all of this on the fly, and I started then dancing around her levels, just the emergent levels, whatever they were, coming through the filters, taking the threshold line above, then below, then above, then below. And when I iterated that 5-6 times max, if it was the augment target like SMR beta that I used, the level would drop a bit and then shoot up to a new level and stay there. The inhibits did exactly the opposite. I would do the same behavior, dancing above and below the threshold line. That inhibit target would jump up just a bit for a moment, and then it would sink down to a new level of lower activity stabilized. So it was very clear we were not doing operant conditioning, a la the way the field as a whole thought was going on. In fact, we could simply dance dynamically with the emergent signal, and the central nervous system would sort itself out on its own. Well, we called that dancing kind of thresholding, dynamical thresholding. So we, in the period 3 approach, it became a fundamental part of what we did, dancing the thresholds like that at times. So we did simultaneous bilateral training of differential or equal augments. So in period 1, we'd have SMR on the right, but beta on the left, whereas in period 2, we'd have alpha on both channels equally, and training at C3, C4 the whole time. So multiple bilateral inhibits, which were all the same, and we basically have kept those targets in close form over the years. And so it was sequenced, syncopated, and simultaneous training made possible, and realizing that that was useful because it sped everything up, for one thing. Instead of having 5 separate phases, you now had 3 periods of training that you could dance, 2 of which consolidated 2 of the separate trainings into one training event. When we use time variable and time delayed multimedia feedback, this is when we were first starting to use music and interrupting the music as the way of working, or the visual, interrupting the visual. It was pretty crude, but that it worked was really quite revolutionary. So the period 3 in the clinical view, you would inhibit 3 to 5, 8 to 13, and 23 to 38 hertz bilaterally, augmenting C4 SMR and C3 beta, and obviously that would be done eyes open because you don't want to inhibit 8 to 13 with eyes closed. Period 2 was bilateral inhibits of 3 to 5 and 23 to 38 hertz, augmenting 8 to 13 and 19 to 23 hertz at C3 and C4. And this invited 7 hertz crossovers. The 19 to 23 was the aura rhythm that we had come across in the work that we were doing, looking at what was happening for folks who were perceiving what they called to be auras. And we saw that when they were doing their work and this interesting perceptual event was occurring, they had activity centered around 21 hertz that you just didn't see at any other space or time. So we started playing with feeding that back as well and found that it was kind of a hyper alpha. It had all the good bennies of alpha augmentation and none of the side effects, profoundly relaxing. And then in period 3, we would inhibit 3 to 5, 8 to 13, 23 to 38 hertz bilaterally, the 8 to 13 when the eyes were closed. Would be inhibit when the eyes were open, but if the eyes were closed, we'd take that inhibit off. And we'd be augmenting 19 to 23 and 38 to 42 concurrently or sequentially. So the aura, but also the 40 hertz rhythm, which we found to be kind of a hyper beta. It gave us all the bennies of beta training and none of the downsides. So if we want to look at this in terms of all of the targets, it was kind of like interlocking triangles. We had alpha, SMR, beta, 21 hertz, and 40 hertz, and we were dancing around all of these targets in this dynamical fashion, having to do it all manually though. So that wasn't really great. The period 3 approach, 3 inhibits when the eyes were open, so 3 to 5, 23 to 38, and 8 to 13 if eyes were open. But if eyes were closed, we took out the alpha inhibit, and we still kept 3, 5, and 23 to 38 as inhibits. So what we were really doing was phase state shifting in a 7 to 8 dimensional space, depending on how you want to think about it. There was 2 always inhibits, 3 to 5 and 23 to 38, regardless of the period, regardless of eyes open or eyes closed. 1 swing target, which was 8 to 13 at C3 and C4, and the swing was eyes open, it was an inhibit, eyes closed, it was an augment. So you would swing back and forth, and we did have clients alternate between explicit eyes open and explicit eyes closed because we had to do it that way because we had to manually take off the alpha inhibit when we really didn't want to inhibit it, but we wanted to augment it. So eyes closed, it would be an augment. 4 potential augments for flexibility. SMR, which was 12 to 15, really centered at 14 hertz, and C3 beta, 15 to 18. 19 to 23 at both at C3 and C4, so bilaterally symmetric for the aura rhythm, and then bilaterally symmetric as well for the 38 to 42 hertz. So the 3 distinct bilateral inhibits were to promote resilience. The target range was 2 to 6 hertz, capturing 3 to 5, and that was to hold in place as much as possible the emotional and cognitive reactivity. And that's all in the cartography of consciousness as well. 18 to 13 with eyes open, we wanted to inhibit that to diminish dysphoria and disengagement, that sort of floaty, distracted state. And 23 to 38 hertz was hypervigilance and dredging and mulling. So all of those were important inhibits when the eyes were open. But the alpha was the swing target, which became an augment when eyes closed. And so fractionating between eyes open and eyes closed became a very important part of dancing the period 3 approach, which was necessitated by the limitations in the technology. So the period 3 approach actually used targeting by multiple bilateral joint time frequency based targets. And so here you can see sort of the cusp of the resilience targets when eyes were open. And I have them as little green sort of U's across the spectral range that we were using then. And here's our 14 to 15 hertz centered targets, SMR and beta. There's our 7 hertz, which is the crossover frequency that we always want to allow. Then there's 21 hertz, which was the center point of the 19 to 23. And it became very clear that we had these rough 7 hertz resonances, with the exception of 14 and 15, which were lateralized right and left. 14 appeared to be important on the right hemisphere, and 15 seemed to be important on the left hemisphere. What's become fascinating over the years is we were able to drop the 15 to 18 hertz target entirely, train 14 hertz up bilaterally, which is inherently a safer process. And that allowed the 15 to 18 to renormalize itself as it needed to. Well, what organizes the what we call the flexibility targets, or the things that back in the old day we would have called augments? Was it their neuropsychological function? No. Was it their neuroanatomical localization? No. Was it a simple periodicity? No. But there does seem to be a rough 7 hertz resonance. And we started adopting this 7, 14, 21, 28, et cetera, and programmed it into the bilateral spectral density display so that people could actually start to see it. Because up till then, if and when spectral density displays were done, they were put out at 5 hertz resonances. And 5, 10, 15 are resonances that you really don't want to see a lot of. 5 being the cognitive dysfunction, 10 being eyes open alpha, and 15 being the gateway into the tunnel vision of the fight-flight reaction. Well, there does seem to be this 7 hertz resonance thing, except for 40 hertz, which if it were a simple periodicity would be 42. So clearly it's not. So if you start playing with the math, as I like to do, if we divide 40 by 7, we get 5.71. Okay, so perhaps the fundamental isn't an integer, and that's not surprising because not a lot of nature really is integers. That's sort of our idealization. The interesting numbers are not integers. But perhaps it lies between 5.71 and 7.0. Are there any likely candidates? Well, 40 divided by 6 is 6.8. And approximately that is around the Schumann frequency, the resonant frequency of the Earth itself. So if we now go back and start to look at the information quanta targeting of 7 hertz, and we do it in terms of this 6.8, we can recognize that in fact it really does become 40 hertz. So here's a diagram kind of showing you it is these resonance points, 6 fundamental resonance points that are really spaced around 6.83 is the actual frequency as I've seen it in the data. Okay, so there's an interesting 7 hertz phenomenology in neurofeedback training. So what? And what's the neurophysiology and neuroanatomy that's responsible for that? Well, the so what is that can simplify everything. If you recognize that there's this rough 7 hertz resonance, you don't have to get seduced into thinking you're training discrete sides or discrete centers. And maybe all the apparent differences between all of the other approaches to neurofeedback training are just that. They're just apparent differences, but they're not all that substantive because it's this return of the 7 hertz resonance points that's really going on behind the scenes. And there are good ways to target that are also safe, and then there are less good ways because they're not as inherently safe. Well, the neurophysiology and neuroanatomy concerns the thalamic pacemaker at roughly 7 hertz and being central to the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology. The thalamic pacemaking rhythm seems like a very good starting point for all of this. The thalamic pacemaker is traditionally understood to manifest a range of activity between 7 and 14 hertz. Close examination of the actual data using JTFA and nonlinear dynamical mathematics shows that the activity is largely bimodal, and it oscillates between 7 and 14. So it's a period doubling oscillation. You don't get the thalamic pacemaker banging away at 10 hertz consistently for a long period of time. It will oscillate in that point when it's transitioning between a dominant rhythm of 7 or the period doubling of 14, but it's never going to just hang out at 10 or 11. So it's a period doubling that occurs. So disorders are constraints on a nonlinear dynamical system seen as attractors at 3, 5, 10, and 23 to 38 hertz as an overall range with decreased complexity. And part of the decreased complexity is that we don't see the 7 hertz resonance points. And it's these attractors that diminish, decrease, or preclude the intrinsic healthy chaos of the CNS that we see as the 7 hertz resonance points reemerge. So NF training, neurofeedback training, can be seen as a way to facilitate renormalization instead of it being seen as an imposing of a presumed normality. We don't have to do normative data. In fact, normative data not only don't help, they actually confuse the picture and seduce folks to training in really unhelpful ways. We simply give information to the central nervous system about what it's doing, and it will renormalize itself and re-access its intrinsic healthy chaos. The CNS does know what it needs and what to do to get it. So the central role of the thalamic pacemaking rhythm can help contextualize the importance of renormalizing. And these two ideas go hand in glove, almost literally, and we don't have to directly cite to train the thalamus. It's not like we are going to try specifically to train the thalamus, but if you think about it, if you were going to try, where would be the best sites if you have two? Well, they'd be probably something like C3 and C4. So this allows training to be done in a comprehensive, adaptive manner, as we do it now, which can provide a single overarching perspective that makes sense of every other approach. And all we do is give information to the CNS, and the client's life transforms. It's all a lot simpler than you think. So NeurOptimal as a training system really emerged out of this rich history guided by an overall vision from 30 years before it had its first emergence as neurocare, but always oriented towards how to keep the training simple, elegant, powerful, comprehensive, and individualized moment to moment. That's what the technology lets us do now. And AutoNav is the final version of that. You don't have to adjust anything. And part of what's been fun for me over the years is continuing with the data looks that I do, because I still look at data a lot. And I've always been intrigued when people will say, well, this, that, or the other is working better for them. It's just not as good when they use NeurOptimal. I say, great, send me the data. Let me look at it. And over the years, I have never seen an instance where some other form of training actually outperformed what we do unless it also had enormous side effects with it. And even then, the differential gain was a lot smaller. So it's a lot of fun to have this system now, looking back over the history and all the ways that Sue and I jointly explored these ideas and implemented new things, the dynamical thresholding, the box thresholding, moving to fully automated ZenX modes so that you didn't have to grab the box borders and move it around that way. Instead, they would resize inherently behind the scenes in different ZenX modes. And all of that really were the outcomes of this very intense exploration that Sue and I undertook together, and it just wouldn't have happened in that way without Sue and I doing it together. Okay, we're at a good point here to just take a moment and see if there are questions, and if there are, a good place to post them would actually be in the chat area. I'm going to look at questions right now. Oh, okay, let's see. Yeah, I don't have the the chat feature on for individuals. What you need to do to talk, what you'll need to do is go ahead and post in the chat area, type it. But I'm kind of going back over a few of these right now. Let me see if I can find some. Let's see. Yes, Margaret Harris used to say never train on CZ. Yeah, I always had interesting discussions with Margaret, particularly around her claims around her equipment, because she used to talk about how absolutely critical it was to have the filtering operations occur in very, very fast fashion, etc. And I would point out to her, well, that's really great, Margaret, but the computer system that you use to give the feedback to the client can't give feedback that quickly, particularly not visual feedback. It's limited by the scan rate of the visual display, and back in those days, that was a 40 hertz display rate. So it really didn't matter. It would be as if you took moment-by-moment measurements of temperature, but then wrote them in letters and mailed them to your colleague on the other side of the planet so they'd know real-time what your temperature was right then. I mean, there's the delay of getting the information out that really wiped out all the idea of this ultra-fast filtering and stuff that she was doing. It just wasn't happening on the other end. There was just no way that it could. Yeah, Margaret and I had an interesting history. Let's see. Didn't know what you were recruiting. Yes, exactly. I remember those discussions with Margaret. You know, never train CZ because you don't know what you're recruiting. Actually, it was fascinating because part of the discussion with her and with a lot of others, no one wanted to actually talk the outcomes because they were so committed to these site-specific ideas, and if they really went with something like the 5-phase model, which had very good outcome data, it really undercut everything else that they were doing. So it's absolutely true. If training worked at CZ at all back in the 5-phase days, then all of the beliefs about hyperlocalization could not possibly be the case. There could be benefit to hyperlocalizing perhaps, but the idea that you had to do that or you had to know all of that clearly just wasn't there. And that's one of the reasons why people over the years really didn't want to do head-to-head comparisons of the outcomes that we were getting, because consistently our outcomes were at least as good, if not better, and with lower or no side effects. And then it became very clear, well, why do all the other stuff if you don't need to? If you get an as good outcomes using this single approach, so to speak, why do all the rest? Would I describe emergent variability? Yes, I can't. I'm not going to define it because there are a lot of different mathematical rubrics that can be used to talk about it. And one of them, what we use, is proprietary. It is part of the trade secret. But what we're looking at is, instead of averaged variance, which takes away the history of the change in the variability. It says, you know, there was a range of variability which describes the entire data set. Well, emergent variability, we're actually looking at very small time scales because we want to see all of that detail. It's like scaling down, looking at how long the coastline is of England in Mandelbrot's example, when he was talking about fractal geometry, and that the closer and closer you get, the smaller and smaller scale you use to look at the coastline, you still see coastline all the way down. It doesn't suddenly become something different. And at different scales, what emerges as variability will be different. So when you're flying overhead at a high altitude, you barely see the waves. You see lines rippling across the surface. However, if you're at a close scale of distance, you're in a boat, the wave height makes a huge difference. So emergent variability refers to the time and the time scale, but also the data density to allow these momentary shifts in how the system is shifting to emerge. And tuning that specifically for neurofeedback has been an interesting task over the years. And it's part of what makes the system completely unique. So, do we have any other questions at this point? I'm sorry I didn't weave those in earlier, but we got them now. Let's see. I'm intrigued by the coincidence of the area of the anus, the perineum, and the acupuncture source points. Yes, especially given the vagueness of locations of the homunculus points. Well, yeah. There are a lot of other ways that one could talk about all of this. And a whole other level of the history of this would involve sort of the histories of Sue and I individually. But my background in meditational practice and martial arts and yoga and Chinese philosophy and Buddhist practice and a variety of other things. I also see what we're doing not only as an incarnation of Freud's Project for Scientific Psychology, but as a literal incarnation of the opening sentence of the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, Yoga Naroda Chitta Vritti, which is yoga, reunification, occurs through releasing the rippling of consciousness, or to say it in the way we would say it, release the turbulence and you renormalize. So we're helping the CNS to release its turbulence. We're not forcing it there. And that can be described in terms of the layers of the lived body as described in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, the sheaths, as some people call them, those energetic centers. You can also do mappings of the resonance points throughout the spectral domain to different chakras if you're interested in that. You can also do interesting correlational studies to what happens in chi flow as renormalization occurs. And as is not to be a surprising conclusion from the perspectives of those older, more comprehensive approaches, none of those things happen in isolation. So the 7 Hertz resonances start to reemerge in sync with the kinds of indicators that a traditional chakra practitioner would be looking for as signs of increased health or optimal functioning, in line with the kinds of indicators that a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner would be looking at, etc. But that's kind of beyond that's beyond the purview of this presentation. It might be it might serve as some subjects for some future webinars for those who are really interested in that. Okay, any other questions right now? That's been a lot, I'm sure, and I had a lot of fun doing it. I'm enjoying doing the webinars. It's a great way to get a lot of this information out and available, particularly to past members. And just I see it as a very important part of the PASS package and the benefits that come from being a member of PASS. So thank you for participating. Thanks for the questions. And that's it for now.